Welcome to On This Day in History, your daily insight into what's happened in the past and how it has influenced the events of the present. As we say, yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. So let's take a short look on what happened today. So on this day in history, the 14th of May, in 1796, English country doctor Edward Jenner administers the first inoculation against smallpox using cowpox pus in Gloucestershire. Well, that sounds pretty gross, but it worked. In 1889, the National Society for the Prevention of the Cruelty to Children is launched in London. Now, that may seem very, very late for the creation of an organization to protect children, but keep in mind this is the Victorian era, this is Victorian London, this is where Charles Dickens' books are set with the workhouses and kids as young as 4 or 5 years old working in factories. The idea that you had to be kind to children was not exactly universally accepted. You had to be kind to rich children, obviously, but poor children, you can do whatever you want. Okay? So that's why this society was created, and they were some of the drivers behind the idea that you couldn't send children to work in mines and factories and dangerous places. The idea that a child is someone who is innocent and needs protection starts from 1889 to become a more nationally accepted and internationally accepted idea. So that is actually a really big deal. In 1944, on this day, some German Nazis, including General Rommel, attempted to assassinate Hitler. Now, it did not work, unfortunately, but this was because they were quite clear that they were going to lose the war. There was no point continuing to fight, yet Hitler would not allow the Germans to surrender. So they thought, we'll solve this issue by killing him, and then we can surrender for ourselves. Didn't work, and they faced some pretty terrible consequences, in fact. On this day in 1948, Israel declared its independence from British administration. Before this day in 1948, it was not known as Israel, it was known as Palestine, or more specifically British Palestine, as they had taken ownership of it, protectorate of it, after the events of World War I. The region of Israel and Syria and Jordan and Lebanon, all of those particular areas there had actually belonged to the Ottoman Empire prior to World War I. So they had been under the control of what is modern day Turkey and had belonged to them for hundreds of years, in fact. It was during the events of Lawrence of Arabia, if you've ever seen that movie, with the fight against the Central Powers in World War I, that it became a British protectorate. And they kept saying, we're going to make it independent, we're going to make it independent. After World War II, they were like, okay, we're sick of these promises, let's just do this thing. And they made it an independent nation. So as far as I'm aware, that was the end of all trouble in that area. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, and in 1955, this thing called the Warsaw Pact is signed by the Soviet Union, Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania. This was an answer to the formation of NATO in many ways. This was meant to be an idea led by the Soviet Union that all of the communist Eastern Bloc is as united as the capitalist West. So this was kind of a big deal because this was just a generation and a half later after the World War I, which had seen two opposing alliances, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, or the Central Powers and the Allies. Because of the balance of power, it had led to this devastating war. So all of a sudden on this day, you get this whole thing where it's like, yeah, you have your side, we have our side, and it looked like war was coming. This was a very scary moment in human history because they just had World War II. Imagine having World War III just 10 years later, only this time with nuclear weapons. Yeah, that would have been bad. But it is time for the deep dive. And for today's deep dive, we're going to look at this gentleman, Edward Jenner, and what he created with the smallpox vaccine. So Who is Edward Jenner? Well, he was an English country doctor. As mentioned, he was from Gloucestershire, and he gave the first actual vaccination as a preventative treatment for smallpox. So this was the idea that you could give someone a medicine, not to treat a disease or to cure a disease, but to stop them from getting it in the first place. That is groundbreaking stuff. On this day in 1796. Now, smallpox was a disease that had killed millions and millions, and there are relations or evidence of the smallpox virus affecting civilizations as far back as 10,000 BC. So it has been around forever, and it was thought to be just one of those things you just had to deal with. So how did he make this miraculous discovery? Well, he used this little known idea, and it was called science. Whoa, who's ever heard of that? Okay, especially in 1796. But this is what he did, okay? So smallpox is a kind of gross disease, all right? You can see it sort of affects your skin. It gives you this terrible outbreak, terrible rash, but it is not just a skin condition. What is it? Well, it kills a third of its victims within 2 weeks. So if 3 people got smallpox, you would expect at least one of them would be dead within 2 weeks. The other 2 had a stronger chance of recovery. If you hadn't died within 2 weeks, you might recover. But if you survived, you had these horrible scars all over your face. You may find when you're studying literature, especially 19th century or 1800s literature, a lot of characters are described as pockmarked. This means they have survived a smallpox epidemic. Okay, now it was incredibly infectious. It caused lesions, boils, growths, scars on the skin. It attacks the skin. It eats away at the skin. It attacks the spleen. It attacks your bone marrow and your lymph nodes if you are infected. So it's not just a bad skin condition. It also causes fever and vomiting. Now, I'm not going to put an actual picture of smallpox here because it's really, 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 really gross, like really gross. If you want to be absolutely disgusted, Google it, and you will see why I didn't include a picture of it. It's gross. Okay, now, smallpox epidemics had hit ancient Egypt, the Roman Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Spanish, British, and French Empire, and is in fact responsible for killing much of the native population in the Americas after Europeans imported the disease to the New World, particularly the Spanish conquistadors in Central and South America, as well as the Portuguese in Brazil, and in fact, even the British in the 13 colonies. So it had absolutely devastated the local populations because they had no natural immunity to it. So had it not been for smallpox, colonialism may not have worked out as well as it did because there would have been this large population saying, hey, you can't actually take our land. But that population was devastated by the smallpox disease. Now, it killed 300 to 400 million people. And when I say that, I mean just in the 20th century. So after 1900, it killed 300 to 400 million people. That is insane. This was a very, very deadly virus. And how do we get rid of it? Well, it all has to do with cows, milkmaids, and a little boy. And of course, Edward Jenner. How does that all come together? I will explain in a moment. So, we know he cured this using science. All hail science. Hooray for science. Woo! Okay, so you can see I love cartoons. But scientists would tell us, as Principal Skinner does in The Simpsons, hurrah for science, woo. Well, I can't say I approve of the woo. We can't necessarily say science is infallible and perfect, but in this case, it's done a pretty good job. So how did Edward Jenner come up with this vaccine? He used the scientific method. Now, the scientific method works like this. You have a question. How do people get smallpox? You gather information, you observe. Look, listen, taste, touch, smell, read, ask an expert. You gather information. You form a hypothesis. So you say, you know what? I think this might work. Then you test that hypothesis. Did it work? If the result is no, then you go back to the beginning, okay? And you gather more information. You form another hypothesis. You test the hypothesis. If you're right, That's when you share the results. Hey guys, look what I've discovered. I figured this out. You do not share results until you have proved your hypothesis. And the way the scientific method works, something is only true if it can be independently verified. So if I say I have cured smallpox with this method, that method is then tried by a different scientist under different conditions. If they get the same result, it is definitely true. Okay, so science actually demands questioning. It demands people to try and prove it wrong. So when something is scientifically proven, it means people have tried to disprove it many, 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 many times. If you ever have something in science you disagree with, it's your job to try and disprove it. If you can, you will win a Nobel Prize for science. If you can't, sorry, it's true. Okay, so this is the way it goes. So science actually comes from a Latin word that means knowledge. And so it's a way of gaining knowledge of the world around us. Now, the word method actually comes from Greek, and it means road. So scientific method literally is the path to gaining knowledge. That's pretty cool. Okay, so Edward Jenner, I told you, milkmaids, cows, and a small boy. He noticed that milkmaids who had contracted cowpox, a less deadly form of smallpox, didn't get smallpox at all. And he used this information to create the first vaccine. So he was just a medical student, and he noticed that all these milkmaids who had had cowpox from dealing with cows, because that's what they did as a job, they were milking cows, they did not end up developing smallpox because they'd had this less severe version of the disease called cowpox. So on May 14th, on this day, 1796, this is what he did. He took a cowpox blister. So he found someone with cowpox, a milkmaid with cowpox, and he popped that blister, took the fluid, and he scratched it into the skin of an 8-year-old boy named James Phipps. So that is really, really, really gross, but it was a good idea at the time because this is what ends up happening. So he gave him this this lesser version of the disease called cowpox, and a single blister rose up on that spot. So instead of the hundreds and hundreds of blisters that would develop from smallpox, he got one blister, but he recovered quite quickly. In fact, he then followed up this experiment, and he did the same thing instead of using cowpox, but using smallpox blister. And young James did not develop smallpox at all. He was immune. Now, this was, I should point out, built on the idea that he had noticed where if someone recovered from smallpox, they didn't get it again. So the idea was that once you had survived it, your body was immune. You couldn't get it again, which meant your body remembered how to beat the disease. So the idea here was, hang on, if we give them a lesser version or a small part of the disease, their body will develop antibodies. Their body will develop the knowledge to defeat that virus. So that if it ever comes across it again, it will not take hold. They will be immune. So once you've beaten the disease once, your body remembers how to do it, and you will never, ever get it again. Okay? So doctors all over Europe soon adopted Jenner's innovative technique, leading to a drastic decline in new sufferers of the devastating disease. Now, this is where the scientific method comes in. Once he published his study, once he decided to share his information with the rest of the world, for a very, very long time, a lot of doctors said that can't possibly be right. That's not the right thing to do. You shouldn't treat people like that. And they did all of these tests till they found out actually he was right. So even though this occurred in 1796, we can see here, this little chart is a chart of smallpox deaths just in London. So we can see there are thousands of people that are dying of smallpox each year. Now, I should point out with this information, it is obviously incomplete. It's from the 1780s onwards. So this is only people that we know died of smallpox. There would be many, many, many more that had just died, been buried, and they didn't necessarily report it to the authorities. Oh, by the way, my aunt died of smallpox. They just say she died. They just say she died, or he died, whoever it was. So the deaths would actually be much, much higher than this, most likely. But we can see it's every single year, thousands upon thousands of deaths. But then eventually, through the 1800s, it gets less and less and less. And that is because in 1853, there was a law passed called the United Kingdom Vaccination Act, and it made vaccination against smallpox compulsory. So before 1853, you had to decide, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this kid who's never had smallpox down to the doctor and get him a vaccination. Now, not a lot of people were doing that. Some people were, especially if you happened to live in areas that were prone to smallpox epidemics. People would do that, but it was not compulsory. When they made it compulsory in 1853, which is right here, you can see there is quite the decline. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yes, but sir, in 1871, you had the largest amount of smallpox deaths ever recorded in London. That means that so many people must have died and the vaccine didn't work. That's not entirely true at all. In fact, what had happened was this was about 20 years after the vaccination was made compulsory. So they did a specific study to see exactly how many people had died of smallpox that year. So as I said earlier, there are a lot of people that died and they were just reported as dead, not dead from smallpox. Whereas in that year, when they did a specific study, they found every single person who died of smallpox, not just the people that were reported to have died of smallpox, which is why you see this massive spike. But it is also indicative of the fact that, as I said earlier, many more people must have been dying each year. But it also shows that decline, because you never see a spike that high ever again. So this little region here means within one generation, so within 30 to 40 years, smallpox is no longer a major health issue in London. Hooray for vaccines, hooray for science. Now, smallpox eventually becomes eradicated from the planet altogether. Wow, that's amazing. So the United Kingdom started this by making the vaccination compulsory. So the law that made it compulsory said any child born after the 1st of August 1853 had to be vaccinated against smallpox. Now, why would they do this to children? Well, there are many reasons actually. One is the fact that the earlier you give someone a vaccine, the less likely they are to get it. If you say, I'm not going to give you a vaccine until you're 10 years old, that gives you 10 years to contract smallpox, which is bad. So the earlier you can give someone a vaccine, the longer they are living their life immune to a virus. So that is why we do it at such a young age. The other reason that, well, there's many other reasons, but another reason for that is younger children tend to have more responsive immune systems, meaning they are less likely to get sick from diseases such as this because they don't have underlying health issues. They haven't already had injuries, or they haven't been eating a poor diet for many years, for example. They don't have those other issues that could affect their immune system, meaning that they're much more responsive to these particular vaccines. They create antibodies faster and stronger antibodies as well, which is quite useful. And of course, another reason to give children the vaccine at such a young age, you can therefore ensure you are tracking who is and is not inoculated all the way through the years until you develop what's called herd immunity. Everyone is immune, rather than saying, oh, hang on, did you get it yet? Did you get it yet? You just know, hang on, if you're over age 5, you've got the vaccine, that's fine. So that's all the reasons we give vaccines. Not all, but some of the most important reasons we give vaccines to children. So it took more than 200 years after 1796 to eradicate the disease from planet Earth. So this is a disease that had been around since 10,000 BC, and thanks to Edward Jenner and his scientific method, it's not around anymore. So the last known naturally occurring case, there have been some instances, unfortunately, with experimentation in laboratories for the purpose of medical research and things of this nature where people have got smallpox. But the last naturally occurring one was October 26, 1977, according to the Center for Disease Control. And the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated for good in 1980. So hooray, smallpox is dead. Congratulations to Edward Jenner for discovering this particular vaccine, and indeed encouraging science to look at how to do this for other vaccines. For example, polio would also be eliminated. There are other vaccinations that you get given through the years as a child, for example, for things like tetanus or rubella, meningitis, all sorts of particular diseases. So thank you to Edward Jenner for giving the world this. And please, if nothing else, I hope you have realized that vaccinations are a good thing. A, vaccinations work. B, and we are probably going to be very, very thankful if they develop the vaccine for COVID-19. So we've got that to look forward to as well. So I hope you've enjoyed today's deep dive. I hope you see why it is so relevant for the world today. And I hope that maybe one day you grow up and make such an amazing discovery that you save hundreds of millions of lives as well, especially mine. Thank you very much. Have a good day.